"Stay down!" someone shouted, but she had already moved. In the pale glow of the hospital parking lights, 27-year-old nurse Emily Tran dove forward. She shielded an older man in a faded military jacket just as the gun went off. The bullet hit her shoulder. She whispered through the pain, "Tell him it's not his fault." But no one expected what would happen the next morning. 12 Marines stood outside her house in full-dress blues. Who was that man? And why did her sacrifice echo across the entire Corps? Emily Tran woke up in the hospital room. Her left shoulder was wrapped tight. Her old uniform shirt still showed bloodstains she hadn't had time to wash. Everything felt like slow motion. The dim yellow parking lot lights, someone screaming, "Stay down!" Then the gunshot tearing through the night air. She couldn't remember the exact moment she lunged forward. She only remembered his face. The older man in that worn military jacket. Buttons crooked. Eyes that had never found peace. She had jumped, taken the full bullet in her left shoulder, and before collapsing, she whispered to another panicking nurse, "Tell him it's not his fault." Emily didn't know his name, but his face felt familiar, like someone from an old photograph, or a story her father used to tell. They called it professional instinct, but Emily knew better. It wasn't instinct. It was choice. The doctor checked her bandages. "You're lucky," he said. "Half an inch lower and—" Emily wasn't thinking about luck. She was thinking about those eyes, the way they looked when the gunman appeared. Not scared, resigned, like he'd been expecting this moment his whole life. "The man I helped?" Emily asked. "Is he okay?" The nurse hesitated. "He stayed until you were stable. Then he left. But he seemed different. Shaken." Emily stared at the ceiling. White tiles, fluorescent lights, the smell of antiseptic. This was her world. Healing people, making things better. But something about last night felt bigger than medicine. Her phone buzzed. Text messages from coworkers. "Are you crazy? Why would you do that? You could have died." Emily deleted them without responding. How could she explain that some moments demand everything from you? That walking away wasn't an option? A young police officer knocked on her door. "Ma'am, we need to ask about the incident." "I told you everything already." "The man you saved, Calvin Morris, former Marine, 3 tours in Afghanistan." The officer paused. "He's been living off-grid for years. No family contact. No VA benefits." Emily sat up straighter. "Why?" "Apparently fell through the cracks. Paperwork issues." The officer shrugged. "Happens more than you'd think." After he left, Emily stared out the window. Somewhere out there was a man who'd served his country, who'd been forgotten by the system he'd protected. Who thought he deserved whatever violence found him? She had changed that story. For one moment, someone had stood between him and harm. Emily didn't know it yet, but that moment had awakened something. Something that had been sleeping in an entire generation of Marines. Something that would bring 12 men in dress blues to her door. Comment, "Semper Fi," if you believe in honoring those who step up without asking why. The chaos happened fast. Customers screaming, people diving behind cars, Emily crashing to the concrete, blood spreading across white hospital scrubs. Calvin Morris, the man she'd saved, caught her as she fell. His hands shook, his eyes went red, his lips moved in silent words that sounded like apologies to himself. Someone called 911. Emily was rushed to emergency surgery. Through it all, Calvin sat in the waiting room hallway. Head down, shoulders bent, whispering prayers to a God he'd stopped believing in years ago. A young cop sat beside him. You related to her? Calvin shook his head. She doesn't owe me anything, but she stepped out anyway. The officer studied Calvin's worn jacket, the faded military patches. You serve? 3 tours. Afghanistan. Calvin's voice was barely audible. Lost my unit. Lost my paperwork. Lost everything. And now? Now someone got hurt because of me. Calvin stood up slowly. Again. Emily woke up in the ICU hours later. Her first words were, "Is he okay?" The nurses exchanged glances. Who? The man. The one I. Emily tried to sit up. Pain shot through her shoulder. Ma'am, you need to rest. Is he okay? Emily's voice was stronger now, more insistent. A doctor entered with a clipboard. The gentleman you helped. Calvin Morris. He stayed until we confirmed you were stable. Then he left. The doctor paused. But he seemed different, like something had changed in him. Emily closed her eyes. She could still see his face, the moment he realized someone had chosen to protect him instead of abandon him. Her phone rang constantly. Local news wanted interviews. Co-workers called her a hero. Her mother cried and asked why she'd risk her life for a stranger. Emily didn't answer any of them. How could she explain that it wasn't about being a hero? It was about seeing someone who'd given up on being worth saving. Meanwhile, Calvin drove his old pickup to a cabin near the state border. He'd lived there alone for 6 years. No visitors, no phone calls, no connections to the world that had forgotten him. But that night, he did something he hadn't done in years. He picked up his phone. He called 3 old Marines from his unit. Men who'd made it out. Men who'd built lives while his fell apart. Something happened, he told each of them. His voice was different, steadier. A young woman. She took a bullet for me. A stranger. The conversations were short, but something passed between these old warriors, something that hadn't stirred in years. The next morning, Calvin stared at a piece of paper. He'd written on it, with shaking hands, I was never anyone important, but what she did made me feel human again. CM. He drove back to the hospital, left the note with a nurse, then disappeared again. But the phone calls had already started. Marine to Marine. Unit to unit. The story spreading like wildfire through a brotherhood that never truly breaks. Somewhere in Camp Pendleton, a master sergeant heard the story. He put down his coffee, picked up his phone, started making calls of his own. By sunset, 12 Marines knew what they had to do. Emily held Calvin's handwritten note for 3 days. The paper was wrinkled from his shaking hands. The words were simple, but they hit deep. I was never anyone important. But what she did made me feel human again. CM, she read it over and over during her recovery. She didn't talk much to visitors, but her eyes seemed warmer, like she knew she'd done exactly what needed doing. Meanwhile, Calvin sat in his wooden cabin near the state border. This place had been his hideout for 6 years after leaving the Marines. No one visited. No one called. He'd learned to live invisible. But something was different now. For the first time in years, he felt worthy. Someone had risked everything for him. A stranger who owed him nothing. That feeling scared him and inspired him. Calvin picked up his old phone. The screen was cracked. The battery barely held charge, but it still worked. He scrolled through ancient contacts, names he hadn't called in years. First call, Sergeant Mike Torres, now a recruiter in San Diego. Calvin? Jesus, man, is that really you? Mike's voice was shocked. We thought you were dead? Yeah, I felt that way too. Calvin's voice was steady for the first time in years. "Listen, something happened. I need to tell you about a young woman who—" The story poured out. The shooting. Emily diving in front of the bullet. Her whispered words. "Tell him it's not his fault." Mike listened in silence. Then, "What do you need?" "Nothing. Just wanted someone to know. Someone who'd understand what this means." Second call. Staff Sergeant Danny Williams. Now a VA counselor in North Carolina. "Calvin Morris? Holy hell. We've been looking for you for years. Your paperwork got lost. We tried to track you down for benefits." "That doesn't matter now," Calvin interrupted. "There's something you need to hear." He told the story again. Emily's sacrifice. The note she'd asked the nurse to give him. It's not his fault. Danny was quiet for a long moment. "She didn't know you. Had no reason to." That's what makes it matter. Third call. Captain James Rodriguez. Active duty. Camp Pendleton. "Morris? Where the hell have you been?" James's voice carried command authority. "Do you know how many of us have been worried? I didn't think anyone cared." "Are you kidding? You saved half our unit in Helmand. We've been trying to find you to make sure you got proper medical care." Calvin's throat tightened. "I'm calling about someone else. A nurse named Emily Tran." He told the story a third time. Each telling made it more real, more important. James listened carefully. As a current Marine officer, he understood something Calvin didn't yet realize. This wasn't just one woman helping one veteran. This was bigger. "Calvin, what's her full name? Where does she live?" "Emily Tran, works at St. Mary's Hospital." Calvin hesitated. "Why?" "Because what she did, it represents something. Something the Corps needs to recognize." After the calls ended, Calvin felt lighter. Like a weight he'd carried for years was finally lifting. But 48 hours later, something started moving in the Marine Corps network. James Rodriguez called his commanding officer. Who called his colonel? Who called Marine headquarters? The story spread through official channels. But more importantly, it spread through the unofficial brotherhood. Marine to Marine. Base to base. Emily Tran had done something extraordinary. She'd shown a forgotten veteran that his life still mattered, that someone would stand between him and harm. The Marines had a phrase for this: leave no one behind. But Emily had taken it further. She'd stepped forward for someone she'd never met, someone society had forgotten, someone who'd given up on being worth saving. Master Sergeant Robert Chen finished reading the report at Camp Pendleton. He put down his coffee, picked up his phone. "I need 11 volunteers," he told his unit. "Dress blues, we're making a house call." By midnight, 12 Marines knew exactly where they were going. And why? Emily Tran was about to learn what happens when you show a Marine he's still worth fighting for. Monday morning. Emily was home from the hospital for the first time in a week. She wore a gray sweater and soft music played in the background. Her left arm was still in a sling, but she managed to make coffee with one hand. She heard engines outside, heavy vehicles, multiple doors slamming. Then the sound of boots on pavement. Synchronized, deliberate. Emily looked out her window and froze. 12 Marines stood in formation on her front lawn. Full-dress blue uniforms, white gloves, covers perfectly aligned. They looked like something from a movie. The lead sergeant stepped forward. Master Sergeant Robert Chen. His voice carried across the quiet neighborhood. "Nurse Tran, we heard what you did, and we came to say, Semper Fi." Emily's coffee mug slipped from her hand. It shattered on the kitchen floor, but she didn't notice. She opened her front door with trembling fingers. The Marines remained at attention. Neighbors were coming out of their houses. Cars had stopped in the street. "I don't understand," Emily whispered. Captain Martinez stepped forward. He carried a wooden box. "Ma'am, what you did for Marine Calvin Morris, it represents the finest traditions of service. You exemplified what we call leave no one behind." He opened the box. Inside was a challenge coin. The Marine Corps emblem gleamed in the morning sun. These coins were only given for extraordinary acts. Acts that embodied Marine values. "But I'm not military," Emily said, tears starting to form. "No, ma'am. But you showed us what a Marine looks like in civilian clothes." Emily took the coin with shaking hands. It was heavier than she expected. Warmer, too. "Calvin," she managed to say. "Is he okay?" Sergeant Torres smiled. "He's getting the help he should have received years ago. His benefits are being processed. His paperwork is being fixed. But more importantly," he paused. "He said to tell you, the uniform salutes you now." Emily broke down completely. 6 years of nursing, 6 years of helping people. But nothing had ever felt like this. The Marines maintained their formation as she cried. They didn't move. They didn't speak. They just stood there, honoring her the way they'd honor a fallen brother. When Emily finally looked up, she saw something that took her breath away. Her neighbors had formed lines on both sides of the street. Some stood with hands over hearts. Others saluted. Even children stood quietly. The Marines had turned her ordinary neighborhood into a ceremony. Master Sergeant Chen stepped forward one final time. "Ma'am, Calvin Morris saved 12 Marines in Afghanistan. But last week, you saved Calvin Morris. In our book, that makes you family." He saluted. All 12 Marines saluted in unison. Emily tried to salute back, but she'd never been taught how. It looked awkward, unpracticed. It was perfect. The Marines held their salutes until she lowered her hand. Then they executed a perfect about-face and marched back to their vehicles. As they drove away, Emily stood on her porch holding the challenge coin. The neighborhood stayed quiet for a long moment. Then one neighbor started clapping. Then another. Soon the entire street was applauding. Emily didn't feel like a hero. She felt like what she'd always been. Someone who couldn't walk away when someone needed help. But now she understood something new. Sometimes the person you save saves someone else. And sometimes that ripple never stops. A neighbor filmed the ceremony. No words. Just 12 Marines saluting Emily. The video went viral with one simple caption. "A nurse saved a stranger." The Marines came to say thank you. Local news picked up the story, but Emily refused interviews. When reporters asked why she did it, she said simply, "I did what anyone should do." They nicknamed her the nurse who saluted first. A week later, an unsigned letter arrived at the hospital. "I spent 15 years thinking my generation didn't matter anymore, that nobody cared about old soldiers. But you stepped forward without asking who I was. You just stepped forward. I'm getting help now, standing straight again. Thank you for reminding me I'm still worth fighting for. A veteran, learning to hope again." Emily kept the letter in her locker, right next to the challenge coin. Because some acts of courage aren't about being brave. They're about being human when it matters most. Have you ever witnessed someone stand up for a stranger when everyone else walked away? Share their story in the comments below. Because ordinary heroes deserve to be remembered. Subscribe to hear more stories about everyday courage that changes everything. Because sometimes the smallest acts create the biggest ripples.